Could you briefly speak about Sanshinji and your role here?
Sure. So my name is Doju Layton. I'm a novice priest here at Sanshinji. So my role has changed a little bit over the years, depending on other things that have been going on in my life. When I first came here, I actually served as the office manager for about a year. And then I became the tenzo. The tenzo is the cook. So for our various meditation events and retreats and so forth, I would cook all the meals or lead the cooking at least. And then I started graduate school about 4 or 5 months ago. And since then, I haven't had any specific role, but insofar as I'm a priest, I'm still sort of looked to be someone who can answer people's questions and help them with sort of basic things, and just sort of be a general kind of practice leader to a certain extent. So.
And then you're also involved with the Buddhist Studies Association.
Yes. So since starting graduate school, I became involved with a campus group called the Buddhist Studies Association, which has existed on campus, I think, almost continuously since the 90s. And it sort of went defunct for, I think, about a year. And then some of the people who had formerly been involved with it were coming here for sesshin, so I spoke with them a little bit about wanting to restart it when I came and started graduate school. So I've been involved as the co-president. And that's basically a kind of more ecumenical, non-sectarian sort of Buddhist thing that's mostly centered around meditation now.
Could you talk a little bit about how you came to practice Buddhism?
Sure. So I think my first engagement with Buddhism was when I was about 16 years old. I was raised in a household that was not religious. I was baptized, but other than that, I don't think we engaged in any kind of religious activity for my childhood. Not even on holidays. I sort of knew that we were Episcopalian. I was told that, like, you're Episcopalian, but other than that, I didn't really know what that meant compared to any other religion. So at about that age, 16, I started, asking some questions about these sort of things through conversations with friends and so forth. And in kind of examining questions about, does God exist and so forth, I found some Buddhist websites that sort of were, a little bit, I guess, critical of Christianity and said, instead of that, you could do this. And they described Buddhism. And I was like, oh, that sounds nice. I like that. And then from that time, I sort of, would casually read Buddhist books occasionally, but never really practiced or anything. As an undergrad, I had a friend who led a meditation club, and I would go to that sometimes, but not very often. And I didn't really think of myself as a Buddhist. But my real sort of entrance into practice came when I was in graduate school. And after about a year in the program, I sort of decided that I didn't want to be an academic. And I sort of fell into this panic of what I was going to do with my life, because I had spent most of it sort of preparing for that. And thinking back to my previous engagement with Buddhism, I sort of thought, well, maybe I should look into that more seriously and see if there's some answers there for me. And I started practicing at a Zen center called the Missouri Zen Center in St. Louis. And I very quickly took to the Zazen practice and kind of the theory behind it. I feel like fairly quickly I felt like more at ease with the trajectory of my life and didn't feel like I needed to worry quite so much as I had been. I think as a result of Zazen, but also the sort of Buddhist, or maybe specifically Soto Zen Buddhist philosophy.
So follow up on that. Hojo-san has talked about Kotosawaki's idea of Zazen being good for nothing.
Right.
And he talked about one of the harder things for especially Americans to come to in the practice is coming in wanting something and wanting to use it to fix something.
Right.
So you did speak to kind of how you felt this has kind of bettered your life. So could you talk kind of about like that philosophy?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's an interesting sort of paradox because, of course, everyone comes to the practice with some sort of desire to fix something that they feel is missing in their life. I think no one just sort of randomly walks in and says, oh, like I don't really have any goal, but I'll try this today. So I think that's always there at the starting point. I think where that phrase that Zazen is good for nothing becomes important is how we approach the practice. So I think if we're sitting in Zazen expecting some kind of outcome, then that's problematic and will sort of, basically it means if you're sort of doing that, you're not really doing Zazen because you have some thought that you're grasping onto. You're not opening the hand of thought, as we like to say. You're not letting go of your attachment to thinking. So I think it's sort of, we sort of need to hold both of those things at the same time. On the one hand, the practice has to be good for nothing. And only when we do that does it have any kind of real world outcome for us. If you're grasping at that, then it's not going to happen. But if you can let go of it in your practice, I think it starts to manifest itself.
So as an American who grew up in at least a nominally Christian household, how do you feel like your own cultural contexts and biases have affected your practice within Buddhism?
So yeah, I'd say before, I'm a graduate student in the religious studies department, so we look at these questions quite directly. But I'd say maybe prior to my doing that, I might have answered the question and said something like, oh, not very much, or something like that. But now that I've kind of looked at this a little bit more, I think that, Americans have a very strong kind of Protestant Christian bias about everything, not just about religious matters, but I think that really colors the way that we see the world. Even if you're not, from a nominally Christian household, I think you could be from a Muslim household. If you grew up from birth to adulthood in the United States, you'd still have probably a Protestant Christian bias in some ways, just because that's what our culture sort of instills in people. One of those ideas is that, practice is something that's very individual, like something that I do for myself, and it has nothing to do with other people. I think that comes from, the Protestant idea that there's a universal priesthood, basically, that each person is kind of directly communing with God without any intermediary. And I think in Buddhism, that's not really how it would have been prior to its arrival or engagement with the West, because the communal aspect is really important, and especially in Mahayana Buddhism, we don't even recognize in all forms of Buddhism, you don't recognize the self, but in Mahayana Buddhism, we emphasize our interconnection with all beings and things. So to think of practice as individual is almost nonsensical from a Buddhist standpoint, but nonetheless, because we're Americans, I think we often think of it in that way.
So looking at that base idea of kind of the modernizing trend in global Buddhism, or even in Japanese Buddhism, because we can look at Kodosawaki and Kosho Uchiyama kind of as reformers who were part of this larger movement. Mm-hmm. American Buddhism is clearly part of that. Do you think that changes happening within the developing American Buddhism is simply part of that larger modernizing movement, or do you think there are things within the American part of that that are divergent or different? And I think there's a bit of a both and probably here. But. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I think from the Japanese side, if you look at modernizing in Japan, in some ways it's sort of more rhetorical than actual. So I think when Japanese present their kind of Buddhist philosophy, it has a very modern tone now. But a lot of the practices as they're done in Japan are still very traditional. So if you go to a Japanese monastery, it's still sort of doing things similar to what they would have been doing prior to Buddhism's modernization, in certain respects anyways. But I think in the United States, the form that practice actually takes is very different from an even modernized Japanese Buddhism. So one maybe example that I could give is we have a sort of ritual that's done called the Dharma combat ceremony. So when a monk is a monk or nun or a priest is training to become sort of a fully fledged teacher, they have to go through this Dharma combat ceremony, and basically everyone in the Sangha will ask a sort of pointed question to the person they're expected to very, sort of immediately answer the question, sort of, from the heart. In Japan, these are completely scripted, so everyone just memorizes the question and the answer. And so it's a very formalized ritual. But in the American context, I think, what Westerners have always sort of tried to do is look for what's the essence of Buddhism. Is that really the essence of Buddhism, to be reading off a script? No, I don't think so. And this is sort of similar, I think, to our Protestant bias, because that's sort of what Protestant Christians sort of try to do, is look back at the Christian tradition and say, what's the real essence of this religion? Not all this Catholic stuff. It's got to be something deeper than that. So when we do the Dharma combat ceremony, even here at Sanshinji, it's not scripted, and we do it as the way that we suppose it was originally intended to be, which is something that, is trying to get at the kind of level of attainment that the person really has, and them displaying that through their ability to answer questions. So I think that's one example of how modernization is different in the Japanese context versus the American context.
One of the things that Hoko outlined as something happening a lot in America and not necessarily in other places that are modernizing is a large level of Buddhist ecumenicism, or even Buddhist non-nominalism, of Buddhists being Buddhist and not calling themselves Buddhist, even in an organizational sense. So I'm curious, because of your association with both Sanshinji Temple, which is very much Soto Zen, teaching the style of practice that Uchiyama Roshi taught, and then your association with the Buddhist Studies Association, which you've talked about as a very ecumenical group. Can you kind of just talk about the relation between those two things?
Yeah, that's... I think I'm actually quite sectarian myself, I would have to say. I think for the Buddhist Study Association, it's important to sort of allow people to come and practice what they want to practice. And that way we can kind of find common bonds and commonalities. But really, I think that for me, I'm pretty strongly attracted to Soto Zen philosophy, and less so other kind of denominations of Buddhism. And sort of specifically because of the modernizing path that it's taken to a certain extent, is important to me. So there's another person in our group, for example, who practices pretty traditional Tibetan Buddhism, and he sort of really believes that it's important for him to practice sincerely in this lifetime so that he can have a good rebirth and not be reborn as a hungry ghost, or something like that. And I think that's fine, but if I had to do that, I would have a tough time, because I would just sort of say, well, I don't really believe that. And so, I think it's important to have spaces where dialogue can happen and, things can be ecumenical. But I think that people do have beliefs that are important to them, and not everyone's going to have the same one. So I think it's important to have a sectarian space as well, perhaps. So I think they need to coexist. I'm not the kind of person that thinks that we should get rid of all Buddhist denominations and somehow combine them into one. I think that would be sort of a least common denominator sort of thing.
So working with these ideas of kind of everyone is going to come to it with their own belief and kind of take from it, maybe not what they will, but what they can, maybe. And having spaces for those being important. And I think that is what a lot of people are trying to do with ecumenical spaces. I would tend to side with you in that just whitewashing, as it were, is doing violence to the traditions that arise. But we do need those spaces. We've been talking about purely Buddhist ecumenicism. Hojo-san, in his interview, talked about how one of the reasons he located in Indiana, or in the heart of the Midwest at least, was because it is a more religiously conservative area. And he actually wants there to be like more option for kind of not just Buddhist dialogue, but interreligious dialogue. And he said that like a lot of the places on the west or east coast, because many of those areas are either irreligious or significantly less religious, that there are people there that have come to centers that have never stepped foot in a Christian church, or just that dialogue is not happening. So I'm curious, in seeing that dialogue in Buddhism, can you kind of see that dialogue happening here in the Midwest in particular, interreligiously?
So you mean kind of a Christian-Buddhist dialogue specifically, or?
Yeah, I suppose that is the thing to talk about. Yeah, ecumenicism, not just within Buddhism,
right,
which in America that means Christianity.
Yeah, I think that can it happen in Indiana? I think it does happen to some degree. Maybe not quite so openly, but certainly people come here who have stronger Christian backgrounds than someone like me, for example. I remember we had someone who came and stayed here for about a week who was actually a student at a Bible college somewhere, and he was sort of specifically interested in having some sort of interreligious dialogue, or maybe, he wasn't structuring it quite like that perhaps, but he was, I think, trying to understand how his own tradition related to this one, and how they might be similar and how they might be different. And I remember doing the beginners night that we do here with him. So I felt like that was a specific instance where there was definitely some interreligious dialogue happening, because I was sort of trying to say, well, in the Christian tradition, it's sort of like this. And, he would then respond after me saying something about Buddhism, like, oh, that's like this, or not like this, or whatever. So I think that does happen, but I also think that maybe it's a bit of a kind of idealistic vision to think that that'll just happen on its own, because Bloomington is its own kind of little coastal town, in the Midwest, basically. So most of the people that come here are kind of, quote unquote, liberal elites. And it's sort of a self-selecting crowd. So yeah, I don't know if that answers the question completely, but I'd say that it happens to some extent, but I think if we wanted to make it happen, there would have to be a more concerted effort at interreligious dialogue.
Historically, when Zen came here, it was very much picked up by the Beat generation and some of the hippies, and then some of the punks. So there's this kind of, in the American consciousness of Buddhism, this countercultural kind of thing. Do you think that plays into some of these changes of kind of leaning toward an ecumenicism, kind of getting away from like that structure? And like maybe do you see that affecting who comes here? Because this is kind of much more of a Soto Zen place.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. Certainly, I'd say the bulk of the people who come here are of the, hippie generation. So the dominant kind of age group are baby boomers. And I think that's the same in most places that I've been at Zen centers, except maybe in California. When I was there, there were generally more young people. And I think that has been sort of a force for, American adaptation in a way that I think is not always very helpful, because there's kind of a fundamental conflict, I think, between like what the hippie generation was trying to do and what Buddhism is trying to do. And, generally the sort of hippie attitude is like, well, I can do whatever I want. I'm going to do it the way that works for me. But in the context of our tradition, we sort of say, yes, this is geared towards freedom. But as my old teacher in St. Louis would say, it's not the same as licentiousness. So, it's not just like doing whatever you want. It's not that kind of freedom. So I think that the understanding of what freedom means is problematic and different from the Buddhist perspective versus the kind of hippie perspective. And I think that the sort of hippie types would try to impose maybe that more licentious type view of freedom onto the tradition, when I think that's sort of fundamentally at odds with what Buddhism has traditionally tried to do, which is actually something that's much more structured and not kind of open to individual interpretation. An important part of this practice is letting go of your own ego and just sort of like going along with what everyone else is doing, so that you're not kind of, again, we fundamentally hold that there is no self, and if you're constantly sort of trying to impose yourself onto the practice, that is not very conducive to letting go of notions of self.
So you talked about having practiced a little like out in California. Mm-hmm. So how do you find practice differing there to here? Just pretty directly, because that's something that's been commented on, that change is happening a lot faster, like in the large coastal centers versus places like mm-hmm. this.
Yeah, I sort of wonder. So in our specific context here at Sanshinji, I think that in certain ways, Hojo-san, our teacher here, is quite traditional, at least within the sort of modernist Japanese kind of context. So he, of course, is quite different from someone who would have been practicing in Japan in, 1850 or something. But, he's certainly not like a Californian hippie. But at the same time, he's a very sort of hands-off kind of teacher. So unless it's something very egregious and noticeable, he usually will just sort of let people go in the direction that they choose to go. He sort of tells people that, you're here to kind of watch people that can be an example for you, but he doesn't necessarily enforce that. So we get kind of all kinds of people, I think, coming through Sanshinji. But because he's here, and because at least, some people, I guess, continue to sort of follow that idea that he set for us, that, you should sort of be trying to follow me and other kind of people that have been here a long time. He serves sort of through example to keep the place a little bit more, I don't know, traditional seems like a weird word to use, but at least less kind of Americanized maybe than other places. In California, when I was there, so I went to Tassajara during the summer, which is itself sort of an interesting thing, because they're operating, a resort for wealthy people, basically, serving them kind of gourmet food and, very fancy lodging and sort of a kind of, it's in the middle of a national forest, so it's sort of like a getaway that people do out there. And so the people that live there during the summer are doing a little bit of practice. So you do zazen early in the morning and go to talks and things in the evening. But most of the time you're working. And there are rules, and people try to kind of keep things structured, but at the same time, there's definitely a lot of sort of like hippie stuff going on. So, there were, and there are a lot of young people, so people are sort of sneaking off into the woods to have sex, and, you hear stories like this, and, when I was there, I was just like, isn't this supposed to be like a Zen monastery? This is not exactly what I had in mind. There's no drinking, but people are still drinking and smoking pot again out in the woods because there's a huge national forest all around it. So it's sort of a weird mashup. In some ways, they're more traditional than we are because they have more elaborate services than we do. One of the distinctive things about our lineage is that Uchiyama Roshi, my teacher's teacher, decided to focus mainly on Zazen, and he sort of removed services from the kind of daily practices that he did. But out in the San Francisco Zen Center lineage, they do a more elaborate service, and they have other kind of practices that for us would, you could say that they're kind of too traditional for us insofar as we're trying to be more focused on Zazen. But at the same time, I think, the hippie kind of influence on things is a lot stronger out there. And also they have a very strong, like maybe the most striking thing is a very strong sort of like psychologization of Buddhism going on there, where everyone who's there is required to do a practice discussion, they call it, where you you have to meet with some teacher or senior person, like, once a week or something like that, to talk about sort of like how you're feeling, which is definitely not a traditional Buddhist thing. I mean, we have something like that in the tradition called Dokusan, where you maybe during a session would go in and talk to a teacher about very specific like practice related things. But the Californian context, I think, is more kind of like, psychoanalysis inspired. So it's another sort of westernizing thing that's been going on in the tradition.
So you talked a little bit about how, like, even within Soto Zen, like, in some ways, though, the Western centers are Americanizing faster and much more hippie in that sense. In terms of ceremonies, ritual, what have you, they're almost more traditional because of the Sawaki Uchiyama lineage. Could you maybe speak to, since we've talked about kind of how the Americanness of things relates to the larger modernization of things, could you speak maybe to how Sawaki and Uchiyama's kind of reform movement relates to or fits in that larger modernizing movement?
Yeah, so I think that Sawaki Roshi, so that's my teacher's teacher, was a modernizer kind of in a relatively limited sense, like in that he wanted normal people to practice Zazen. And he didn't think it was important for people to be priests to practice. But I think other than that, he's pretty traditional. And you can sort of see this, I think, in the main like European lineage is from a person named Deshimaru Taisen. And he was a student of Sawaki Roshi, but not through Uchiyama, my teacher's teacher. And the way that they practice there is way more traditional than anywhere in the US, I think. Almost everyone who steps in the building, I think, is wearing either robes like me, or if they're lay people, sanwei. So it looks almost like Japan. There's a lot more tatami, the sort of mats that we have here. Everything just has a very sort of Japanish look to it. And yeah, just a much stronger emphasis on sort of form and ritual and so forth. So Uchiyama Roshi, I think, was really the one who made some pretty radical modernization steps in sort of cutting out everything other than Zazen. So he sort of famously said that everything, I mean, he didn't quite say it this way, but the basic idea was things other than Zen Zazen can become sort of toys for our practice. So one of the things that would be done at these European centers that I was talking about is they still use the kyosaku, which is a stick that you use to hit people on the shoulder if they start to fall asleep. And in our lineage, you can also request to be hit on the shoulder if you're starting to feel sleepy by putting your hands in gasho like this. So he said that he felt like the kyosaku was a toy. So the person walking around patrolling the room is sort of looking for people to hit, and the people sitting are sort of thinking about whether or not they're going to be hit, or it just becomes this sort of game. And I think that happens too with service, and I noticed this too because we do have a little limited service that we do here now. But there's sort of like a competitive aspect for who can chant nicely and do the service well and kind of understand the protocol correctly and stuff. And it does become this sort of game, and the various implements we use are sort of like toys. Whereas in Zazen, if you're just doing Zazen, there's nothing like that to grab onto. So for Uchiyama Roshi, he wanted to sort of strip the practice down to below the level of toys. And that's not something that's really been universally embraced in the United States, but I think that it definitely fits in sort of the broader modernization of Buddhism. Like that would have been, I think, unthinkable 150 years ago. So yeah, I think that maybe this lineage in that sense represents the Japanese modernism of Buddhism, and maybe some of the other temples in the US maybe represent more the American modernization of Buddhism. But of course, there's crossover both ways.
So I'm curious, as part of this modernizing movement and Uchiyama's idea with kind of all these things being toys, and the practice is zazen, that's the important piece. Mm-hmm. One of the big modernizing aspects, that McMahon talks about, is Buddhism meeting Western philosophy, mm-hmm. And the understandings going both ways.
Yeah.
There. Within the Western academic understanding of religion, going back to Durkheim, we see the importance of ritual in the religious niche, and kind of the places in our lives that those fill. And we find that if we take those away in an institutional sense, we fill them. Durkheim talks about in Elementary Forms that it doesn't need to be religious to be religious. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious, in this idea of taking away the toys, are we just replacing those things? Or is Zazen that thing? Or in doing Zazen, do we try to need those things less?
I think that Uchiyama's idea with that is that Zazen is sort of and this is part of the Soto Zen philosophy, is that Zazen is sort of where we come into contact with what we might call enlightenment or awakening. So in the Soto Zen philosophy, awakening is usually not perceived to be something that you attain after some period of time. It's sort of the latent kind of quality of the universe that we kind of pollute with our deluded thinking. And in Zazen, we let all that go, and therefore we sort of are sitting on the ground of awakening in our practice. So for Uchiyama, I think the important thing is that if we're thinking about who's going to come hit us with a kyosaku, and should I, pretend like I'm sleeping because I'm bored and I, want to get hit, we're not really sitting on that ground of awakening anymore. We're just sort of playing in the normal reality that we play in all the time. So I think that in a sense, there's this idea of disenchantment in modernity that comes up. So that's from Weber, I think. So he says that, it used to be that we sort of believed that God or gods were interceding in our affairs and stuff, and the world was therefore kind of enchanted in a sense, like magic was something that was happening all the time. And in the modern world, all that's been stripped away, and now we live in this disenchanted world. And so people have sort of tried various ways to re-enchant the world. And I think that Buddhism I think that Zazen is sort of maybe one of these re-enchantment kind of things, because it's something that doesn't really require anything supernatural, but at the same time, in sort of completely letting go of our normal way of existing in the world, we're re-enchanting it, essentially. And you mentioned David McMahon's book, he talks about romanticism. So like one of the kind of themes that we see from the Romantic movement onwards is in books, like literature tends to have very exacting descriptions of what's going on, down to sort of minute details that previous literature would have ignored and thought sort of bad style. And he attributes that again to this kind of desire for re-enchantment by describing mundane things and giving it this centrality. We're kind of trying to re-enchant the world just with ordinary things, and that's sort of like, what Zazen is about too. And whether or not that influenced Buddhism or if we're just sort of using the same language is unclear, I think. But I think that for Uchiyama, the sort of real way to re-enchant the world is through Zazen, not through this other stuff that we no longer believe has any sort of magical efficacy. So, for example, doing a service 150 years ago, people would have really thought that this is going to bring about my rebirth. I get merit from this and I'm going to have a better rebirth as a result of doing this ceremony. Or like I can dedicate this merit to someone who's sick and it's going to make them better. I think there are relatively few Americans who believe that that's the case now. So that is not something that will bring about an enchantment of the world again. But through Zazen, I think both kind of modernists or, scientifically minded people and kind of traditionalists alike can sort of maybe see that might be a route for re-enchantment. So I think for Uchiyama, that is part of the reason why he emphasizes that above other traditional forms.
Hojo-san has talked about not only the importance of Zazen in his teaching here, but also making Dogen's teachings accessible. But obviously within Dogen's teaching, Zazen is the thing. But something else Dogen talks about that you said you held the office of in Tenzo Kyokan is talking about how like the instructions for the cook is almost boiling down to Zazen, is that is part of the practice. So could you maybe, having filled that role in a temple yourself, speak to that aspect of the practice?
Yeah, so Tenzo Kyokun, or instructions for the cook, is one of Dogen's writings where he's kind of explaining how we can bring something like Zazen into our cooking practice and sort of by extension other things in our life as well. And so for that reason, it's an important text, I think, for modern audiences, because we're not mostly living in monasteries and doing Zazen all the time. Excuse me. I think that gets back to this idea of enchantment as well. So I think that in taking this Zazen attitude and bringing it into our normal life, we're kind of bringing that ground of awakening into everything that we encounter, or at least trying to. But at the same time, I think, in my own personal experience, it's really difficult to do that because we've been living in sort of normal reality, doing stuff like cooking our whole lives without sort of bringing that attitude to it. So to suddenly, try to bring this thing that seems very abstract when we think about it into our daily routine is quite difficult. And so in that text, Dogen says that the Tenzo should be like an advanced practitioner, because otherwise people are just going to be cooking. They're not going to be just cooking as they should be. So I think that that narrative is really important. How do we take the Zazen attitude and bring it into our life? But I think both for Dogen and for Hojo-san, it's really important to have that grounded in a Zazen practice. I think if we don't have the Zazen as grounding, we can't really effectively bring that sort of thing into our lives. So, yeah.
Having been to Japan and seen practice, or even seen people's interactions with their affiliation, their local temples. It doesn't even necessarily have to be monks' practice. Mm-hmm. How do you find the engagement in Japan of that practice, be it monks' practice, lay practice, just engagement with the practice within the Sangha differs in Japan than here?
Oh, okay. So in my own personal experience, I don't have much to say to this because, I was only in Japan for 3 months, and I was there teaching English, and, I had sort of some encounter, I went to a few temples that were sort of touristy. And so when you see people, Japanese people visiting temples, they're mostly engaging in, kind of what we might call folk practices that, don't really have much to do with Buddhist philosophy per se. So often it's things like, I lost my car keys and I'm praying to the Buddha that I'll find them, which, in the American conception of Buddhism or the Western conception of Buddhism, that would sound sort of ridiculous. Buddhism is not about praying for things that you want. But of course, in its cultural context, that's often what most of it is about for normal people. And I think, in Japan specifically, a lot of it is centered around the funeral kind of industry. And I actually had personal experience with that when I was there, because I was staying with a friend for a little while, and his grandfather had a memorial service while I was there, and I was able to attend that. So this is the main way I think that Japanese interact with Buddhist clergy is through death. So in this case, it was, I think, a 3-year memorial service, so 3 years after his grandfather's death. And basically a priest came and chanted a bunch of sutras that would be incomprehensible to everyone there. It's either, kind of transliterated Sanskrit or Sino-Japanese, the terms that wouldn't be understood by a normal non-specialist. I'd say that I think that the Japanese don't think that Buddhism has much to offer them in terms of their own kind of spiritual well-being. They're mostly just seen as sort of the people that preside over funerals. And of course, in the U.S., it's completely the opposite. Buddhism exists solely to sort of help people with their problems, and most Americans, I think, would be surprised to learn that their main function is doing funerals or things that we would otherwise consider to be superstitious, like praying for your car keys. So
do you find there are any specifically unique aspects of practice that you see kind of growing in the American Buddhist consciousness that maybe you don't see elsewhere, or even just small unique things that this seems particularly American, the way we do this?
So, and you mean specifically American and not like Western, or?
Can either. Blur those. Feel free to blur those.
Yeah. So I think that I think that maybe the commoditization. So making sort of Buddhist practice more of a commodity is something that has definitely happened here in a way that it hasn't in, I think, it's kind of traditional purview. And so, for example, when I was at Tassajara in California, there was a senior priest there, who had Dharma transmission, so he's a recognized teacher, and he told me that he was taking a job at I think like Google or something like that, one of these tech companies, to be like a mindfulness coach. And for me here at this temple, being Hojo Zen's student, that just seems like completely like anathema to what this should be about. And he, despite having kind of a high level of kind of I won't say like spiritual attainment, but at least like he has the sort of high rank, and he's been around American Buddhism a long time. He didn't seem to have any problem with going to a company and helping basically teach people mindfulness to make them more productive, to make them and other people make more money, which of course I think Dogen would be rolling in his grave if he knew that Soto priests were doing that, because he's very clear that we should have few desires and that we should live as kind of poor a life as possible. And of course, I think in the modern context, there's some wiggle room there, but I think actually using the practice to make money, and not even like in the way that you're, really helping people to learn about the practice. I mean, you're specifically geared at making them more productive workers, not to liberate them or bring freedom to them. So yeah, that seems very American to me, taking something that is fundamentally not about money or actually like opposed to kind of general capitalist assumptions, and then actually putting it in that framework and using it there. So yeah, I think in the United States, if you can make a buck anywhere, you'll sort of do it, and that's happened with Buddhism, and that's one example. But there are others as well. I think they're sort of life coaches that take aspects of Buddhism and basically do the same thing that we as Buddhist clergy are trying to help people with, and sort of helping people live healthy lives, but charging a lot of money to do the same thing. So yeah, I think maybe the capitalization of Buddhism is one specific American thing that is happening, and I think is not good.